there was a big period of time where you just didn't know. You didn't know if anything was going to come together, if this was going to work out. You're just kind of operating on instinct, really. It was never that I was like, I'm gonna make it. Like I never had that feeling. I was just like in the present the whole time. And I didn't, I would absolutely have settled for that kind of career. Like, I still feel like I'm punching way above my weight. I would have been at peace with, maybe I carved out a comfortable, quaint little career or something like that. That would have been fine. And that's sort of what I expected. Although I was definitely driven. I knew things could be better in the industry, and I knew that every time I saw some a film or a piece of art or an illustration or a video game that I felt like I know how to make this better. Like I think I have something to offer here. There was motivation there intrinsically.
Please welcome the brilliant Joseph Cross to this episode of the Learn Squared podcast. Joseph is famous for his stunning work across the entertainment industry, on films like Dune and Ghost in the Shell, to name but a few. But he's also synonymous through his work with Bungie, helping them bring the Destiny universe to life. And now is doing the same again as the art director of Bungie's upcoming marathon game. And in this episode, Joseph reveals how his concept art journey began 10 years after graduating, and initially wanting to be a comic book artist first. So let's get to it and hear how Joseph revels in solving design problems, the creative process around bringing new IPs to existence, and how all the skills he has learned along the way, from graphic design to concept art, has helped him transition to becoming a leading art director, as well as stories in helping develop the iconic still suit from Dune alongside production designer Patrice Vermette and director Denis Villeneuve, and much more. Let's go. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Learn Squared podcast, and got a very amazing guest on today, Joseph Cross. Welcome, Joseph.
Hello.
How is it going? How is it? I guess it's still the beginning of 2025. How was your last year, 2024?
It was good. Years start to blend together at this point, but definitely an exciting year for the project I'm working on, the Project Marathon. Just kind of heads down, rapidly accelerating that project, and things are going sort of incredibly well. I think I'm cautiously optimistic about the visual product we're gonna present to the world sooner rather than later.
We'll definitely get into all of that juicy stuff very, very soon, because we just mentioned there about visual, like just in your work in general, I guess anything that's attributed to yourself, and particularly Marathon, from what I've seen, the visual aspect of it, which might seem like, a given considering the industry that we're in, seems to be very front and center, and something that gets a lot of attention. But before we get into all of that good stuff, let's get to origin story. If you wouldn't mind letting everybody know who you are and what you do.
Yeah. Joseph Cross. I am currently art director at Bungie. My origin story is I come from the Bay Area. So I grew up in San Francisco Bay Area. That's where I went to art school. I'm probably one of a million artists right now who are commercial artists who kind of grew up wanting to be a comic book artist. I've sort of obsessed and curated art, geeked out on artists and collected stuff art related since I can remember. Lead figures and medieval stuff and G.I. Joes and comic books and Sunday funnies and all this stuff. Grew up in and around Berkeley, California. And as soon as I found out that art school was a thing, which I didn't actually know until I was basically graduated high school, and I found out a friend of mine um, was going to the Academy of Art in San Francisco.
Hmm.
Um, I was ready to sort of pack it in and be like an English major at the local community college because I was like a C student. But then, yeah, if it turns out art, you could be a professional artist. So I tried that, and yeah, I went into art school pretty cold, not having really any sense of what I wanted to do other than I knew I loved comics and animation and that kind of thing. I was sort of seduced into the film program initially, um, partly because I knew this friend and I got a sort of glimpse at the curriculum and I saw that one of the first classes in that program you got to make your own trailers and I loved
Wow.
trailers and I loved music. So and that was true. That's one of the first things we got to do was cut our own trailers. You pick your favorite movie, pick your favorite music, and make trailers. And that was just like a dream come true. And it was very old school. So this was like the mid to late 90s. And we're working on, at this point, archaic sort of
Wow.
equipment. But yeah, I remember that. I made two trailers. The first one I made, it was Akira and my sort of in my infinite sort of wisdom I thought the juxtaposition of an Akira trailer to the Ghost in the Shell soundtrack would be really cool.
Right.
So I did that, and then I also remember I did Do the Right Thing to a Tribe Called Quest song. I forget what it was, but that was very short lived, and then quickly figured out that um, illustration was actually where kind of my heart was and where I belonged. And I had been drawing all throughout high school and did murals in the hallways. And my friend and I tried to make our own comic books, and that was really much closer to my heart and sort of my
Mm.
wheelhouse, if you call it that, at the time. So I transferred into traditional illustration. Where I spent, at the time the curriculum was like 75% of the time drawing the figure in charcoal, gesture drawing. And so yeah, I just like that, that is the vast majority of my collegiate sort of memory at this point is just sitting in figure drawing classes, drawing the
Mhm.
figure for hours and hours. Not really knowing why why I was doing it, or what necessarily the sort of the end result or the goal was. But it was really cool, and at the time we had sort of this incredible uh, class of artists, two of which became incredibly successful and were kind of the rock stars of the of the of the school. This guy Jerome Pena, and he's a comic book artist now. His sketchbooks were like contraband. Like somebody made a copy, and then you got a copy of a copy of a copy, and you figured out what pencil or pen he was using, and you had to go rush to the Japanese bookstore to find the pen
Sick.
because that would mean you could do it too. And then Moby Frankie, who went on to be an amazing art director at Valve for a number of years. So we had this really cool like figure drawing culture, illustration culture that
Oh.
went on. But yeah, like I said, I didn't really. It was never really geared towards a specific industry. Even like my work or my portfolio, I didn't really have that. That was never really fostered for me. Like, oh, you're doing all of this because you're going to be a animator or a commercial illustrator or a graphic designer or a fine artist or whatever. You were just it was almost like exercise or something like that. I
Mm.
always think of it's like jogging or something. It was just sort of tuning your body, tuning your craft. So yeah, I don't know how far you want me to go with my origin story, but I can just keep going.
Oh, that it's totally
Yeah.
cool. But I just want to ask a few questions regarding
Yeah.
some of those moments. I mean, like, so similar to my journey when I was in post high school as well. Like the art courses I took was seems to be very similar to yours. It was more introductory into different things as opposed to a specialist thing. Did that bother you, or did you enjoy that looking back?
Um, it didn't bother me.
Mm,
And in hindsight, I think, the sort of subtext, I guess, of the curriculum or of the field was commercial illustration,
mm,
which, like, looking back on it now, is just an incredibly niche, uh, you know, avenue for an artist, and it's hard to it's hard to say how much just like sort of the evolution of sort of the art industry and society has sort of moved away from commercial illustration as a viable sort of path. I think I almost think
mm,
of it as sort of a vestige of like the Mad Men style 60s, 70s era where,
mm.
magazines and print ads were much more important.
Yeah.
Um, so that was that. It made sense that, whatever whatever, like, it's, if you're interested in fine art or commercial illustration or animation or sequential art, the kind of craft muscle building you're doing is still going to be incredibly important.
Mm,
It just wasn't funneled super specifically,
mm,
at least for me. But I didn't mind it at all. Like I said, in hindsight, it was incredibly valuable, and I sort of, think of it as like a badge of honor, almost like
mm.
spending all of those years grinding charcoal and stuff like that. And because I don't, obviously I don't do any of that stuff now, besides maybe once a year going to a
Right.
drop-in workshop or something like that, or sketching at
I
a
get.
cafe.
Is that mainly just due to like being super busy and just not having the time for it?
Um, no, I don't think so. I mean, I think it certainly doesn't have now a direct impact on what I do as an art director. I
Mm,
don't need those chops, really. I wouldn't say. And also, it's true that I've never been. This isn't a generalization, but I've never been. I've sort of think of there's a few different kinds of artists. In my experience, there's artists that um, enjoy the process, and that's part of just their sort of their fiber, their creative fiber. They're just sketching, they love it, they always have a sketchbook in hand, or that's sort of enough for them, just like
mm,
understanding how light and value works in graphite or in oil. Or, like, I've never been that kind of artist. It's always felt like it's more of a compulsion for me. Like, I need to do it.
mm,
I need to make things. I need to try to make things look better. But I would never say I enjoy that from a sort of in a commercial context. And in my personal life, I don't. It gets very competitive to me, sort of psychologically, pretty quickly. So, I've sort of working all those feelings out in sort of different, in different ways now, through art direction and
mhm.
sort of, Photoshop and all these other sort of ways. And so that's, yeah. Um, I think about it, I think about doing it a lot, and it would be nice. And maybe, when I'm 90 or something, I'll be, sketching landscapes or something.
With that said, I think a local museum or wherever it was, there was just a bunch of like, I think it's aircraft or whatever it was. And we was walking past. Obviously, everyone's doing their thing with the kids and what have you. And obviously, with kids, things always tend to be a little bit of a faster pace. You don't really get to absorb and enjoy some of the stuff around. But I remember, like, dotted around, they seem to be not part of the same crew, but there's a bunch of old guys with sketchbooks and just drawing stuff. And I was like, yes, that's my retirement plan.
Yeah,
When the time
yeah.
comes, they seem like a complete bliss.
Hmm.
What about some of those times, like when you use it, even post high school, and like when you was on that course? What would you say are the biggest, either maybe it's ingredients or skills or traits or even just like advice that you probably have gleaned the most from that time that have stuck with you, or even formed your creative philosophy or even your fabric today?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that it's it's this thing where it's hard to sort of define if it's sort of instinct or intent or like nature or nurture, but it was clear for me, at least, even while I was sort of struggling or sort of competing in that sort of space with sort of traditional art, figure drawing, representational art, doing gouache studies or things like that, landscapes. I always knew that my strength was in kind of the graphic representation of stuff, or the sort of um, the graphic composition of shapes and planes, as opposed to value and sort of rendering and really sort of turning form and
Mm.
brush strokes and that kind of thing. Like I always wanted to break stuff down into sort of simpler shapes, graphic appealing shapes. And, looking back, that is clearly my identity, and it's clearly what I lean into, what I try to bring to the table, to the projects I work on. The connection to graphic design. It's why, there's certain artists you're really drawn to. Um, like, I mean, the first one, that it's a kind of a cliche at this point, but J.C. Leyendecker, for example, the way he sort of simplifies form, flattens things out, has these incredibly satisfying graphic shapes and brushstrokes. Like, that spoke to me so profoundly, in a way that, you know, still like a Rembrandt or something like that. Like, I marvel at the work, but I don't identify with it. It's not, there's certain artists that you're
Mm.
like, oh shit, that's like we're from the same sort of tribe, or cut from the same cloth. And then there's artists you look at and you just marvel at, and you just but they're sort of the other in a way. So, looking back, a lot of my figure drawing work had those qualities, of sort of just graphic, proportional, graphic, compositional shape, anatomical shapes, and that kind of thing.
Mm.
So I think you could draw a through line, no pun intended, to even sort of my current um, work and sort of vision. That felt, that feels good, and to sort of acknowledge that, and like accept that too.
I think that's awesome to hear as well, because it's especially for anyone like we get a lot of listeners who are still in the early stages of their careers, and even like they're just training themselves, and obviously veterans too, we're always still learning, we're always still trying to improve. But there is something empowering and powerful about knowing what you like, what you're good at, what you can really lend your voice to even more.
Yeah.
Because it's like, even like with like sports and stuff, like I watch a lot of team sports, especially like football, soccer, obviously over
Hmm.
there. Like you have different positions, have different roles, it can contribute certain things. Like if you look into a granular level, it gets very fascinating.
Yeah.
Also boring as well if you're not into it. But for yourself, like did you know at that time, like, okay, I like doing this, so I'm going to lean into it? Or was it more almost subconscious and you just found yourself like, because sometimes when you're doing stuff, there's a certain stage where you feel either more at one with the process, or you can't
Mm.
wait to get there because you know it's going to be more fun. But sometimes it's just like it passes over you, but then obviously over time you realize what it is. What was it like for
Yeah.
you?
I think, it was a combination of things. Like, I actually get one point you made that made me want to articulate a little bit further. Is one of the thinking of students, thinking of like early in career folks. One of the harder things about what I sort of just described is when your heroes aren't doing the thing that maybe you do intrinsically well. It's hard to sort of stay the course. Like, like, the stuff I felt like I did well, that's not like when I mentioned like Moby or Jerome or somebody like that. That's not necessarily what they did well. So it's really, at the time, it's really hard to stay true to yourself and sort of believe that what you're doing is also compelling and has that kind of value. But yeah, so, back to your other question. I think it was a combination of things. It was intrinsic to some extent. I mean, I think that you know, there's something there's something like talent that exists. You know, I don't know exactly how to define it or describe it or even
Hmm.
what it is, but there's a feeling that I think you have when you're making art and when you're designing or sketching, and you know it when you see it and you know it when you feel it. And I started to recognize that quality within myself, you know, and although you know relatively it was at a very low level, like it wasn't, you know, I wasn't like a rock star student by any stretch. I was like a, you know, I was like a B list student or something like that. But I started to feel like, oh, I have a point of view and I'm doing a thing that I don't see a lot of, and you start to kind of get recognition, minor
Hmm.
recognition from. I always remember, you know, some praise I received from teachers or something. I had a teacher, a figure drawing teacher named Christopher Schenk, who's still teaching, I believe, at the academy. And one time he came over and looked at one of my drawings and was like, "Somebody could do a better drawing than that, but I couldn't." And
Hmm.
that those kind of things are incredibly meaningful
Hmm.
to a student when you get that kind of acknowledgement, especially from a working professional. So the combination of you know, sort of external reinforcement, even little bits of it here and there, are incredibly, you know, potent. And then just starting to really, you know, build those little blocks of like belief in your own vision. That's, you know, that's sort of how it went for a long time. But you know, skipping ahead after that, you know, like I didn't work in the industry professionally for close to 10 years after I
Oh wow.
graduated. I didn't even really graduate.
Yeah.
I left early and then came back and finished online, and that's the next sort of chapter, I guess.
Sick. Well,
Yeah.
that's interesting to hear because I had the same thing. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't get into the industry until 10 years or so after I had graduated. Long
Hmm.
story, we won't get into that, but we'll definitely get into yours. What happened in that time?
Um, yeah, like my sort of, I mean, I think in hindsight, to art school education is, you know, has its um I don't know. I was definitely at the, you know, art at the time the Academy of Art was just like, hey, you have a bunch of money and a, you know, a pencil, you come on in. Like, you know, like it was, there were no real strict standards. And
Hmm.
you know, the percentage of students who graduated and went on to immediately either lucrative jobs or jobs in their field that they were excited about, that they had been sort of training for, I think was incredibly small. And there were definitely some of them, but I was not one of them. I ended up leaving a bit early. Um, I I befriended who turned out to be one of the most important people in my life and then in my career. One of my teachers, who was teaching sequential art at the time, this guy Rick Remender, who's now a wildly successful writer, writing comics and TV and film stuff. Kind of took me under his wing, and we started sharing a studio together. And it felt like, I don't know, it was sort of that sort of classic, like that almost cliche, where I'd rather be trying to sort of scrap together the start of a career working with someone who's really working in the industry than, you know, grind out another year and a half of mandatory credits and curriculum and then
Hmm.
go for $80,000 more in debt or something like that, you know. So I did that. Um, it didn't really manifest in work immediately. I got a taste of it because he was doing comics for Image Comics at the time, and I did some like coloring. I did one or two covers for a few of the things, but none of it paid rent really. So
Hmm.
I and at the time I also had my own sort of portfolios. And I was very like scattered in terms of my interests. Like I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I had like mediocre portfolios for like five industries. I had like concept art, I had comic book, I had graphic design, I had commercial illustration, and I was fine art. And I was like, none of them were really viable.
Mm.
And I just lacked that. That was just part of my identity. I just never had that like laser focus. And Yeah, so basically had to had to pay the rent and worked odd jobs, worked retail for a long time, some construction, and just kind of bounced around for essentially for years, and until I kind of got my break, so to speak, through this guy Rick, who actually had ended up writing draft of the first script for Dead Space One, a video game from EA, and I had my kind of mediocre concept art portfolio, but Rick's sort of sway or pull from that studio was enough so that
Mm.
the art director at the time, this guy Ian Millam, gave me a shot and gave me a shot on Dead Space 2. And so that was my first real job. It was a like remote. I was living in Portland at the time. My wife and I had moved up to Portland, and yeah, just kind of dove in as a environment concept artist on Dead Space 2, incredibly cold, not having any idea, really not even like no style. Like I went into that role thinking I needed to paint everything, at the time, and like really flailed, and was very lucky that Ian stuck with me, and I basically learned how to use Photoshop for concept art on the job, and sort of had kind of an aha moment. There was another concept artist working on the project, this guy Alex Chu, who's still working in the industry. And Alex is an awesome artist, and he's the first one to like. He didn't show me directly, but Ian, the art director, showed me some of Alex's work where Alex was photo bashing, and it was like super quick, effective ideating, and they were looking for architectural motifs. And Alex had done a page, there was some photo bash, some paint, but they were just quick gestures, and they were like six viable ideas that would work for production, and they weren't masterpieces, and I was like, oh shit, like this isn't, you don't get points for being a good
Mm.
painter in this industry. This is about generating good ideas as quickly as possible. And that's sort of, yeah, that was like the lights turned on, and then I figured out photo bashing. Basically, I was like, okay, I can, what's most important is sort of the idea and sort of the inspiration. And that's where I feel like my sort of vision really was able to take hold, because
Mm-hmm.
then it became about like almost like taste, like if you weren't limited by your ability to render light perfectly and with brushstrokes from scratch or something, then you could really stretch your legs quickly and be like, we're looking for architectural motifs. Then it has to really, then it becomes about your taste in architecture, or your
Mm-hmm.
your sort of ability to source compelling um, content, or sort of like I started, it's like finding samples like in hip hop or something like that. You're sort
Yes.
of digging in the crates, and um, so then yeah, and then I was like that, okay, but then we can't just send a picture of like someone's architecture. You have to massage it into a scene, and there's like mass out geometry in the game that you have to work it into, and you just start playing with. I started playing with layer techniques. You discover overlay in Photoshop, overlay layer mode, and all these things start blend together magically, and things sort of show up that you never thought of. Like it starts to introduce this kind of happy accident quality, which I always like, for a lot of reasons. Anyway, it was that whole process was really like a revelation for me. And about halfway through Dead Space 2, it clicked. And then, my work, that work is up on ArtStation or something. I look back at that and still say, yeah, that's clearly me. That's my identity there. It still holds up. I can see it's such a clear through line, between what came before, what that was, and what I'm doing today. And that was, it's very sort of satisfying.
Incredible.
Yeah.
A lot of things I can relate to, especially like in the. I got a few questions. We'll start with the first one. What was it like in that time? Like, I guess from graduating to picking up this job. Like, what was your? You mentioned obviously like you were still figuring things out. You had your multiple portfolios. I can definitely relate to that. I think so many
hmm
people can as well. Um, what was your mentality like? Like, was it filled with but I'm sure a bunch of things? Was it more like, okay, how am I going to get this to work? Or was it more determination? Like, okay, I'm going to make this work. I just need to find a pathway. What was your, I guess, psyche like at that time?
It's a really good question. And I mean, thinking back on it is crazy. Like, I'm not sure. Like, I'm not sure, I'm not sure what my psychology was. Um, my goal was certainly to stay as close to art as possible,
Mm,
regardless of what it was. Like, I wanted, if I was not like literally like working at an art supply store, which I worked at two art supply stores. I worked at an art store in Berkeley, and then when I moved up to Portland, I worked at an art supply store. Um, so I was, I just knew that I needed to stay close to it. And even if that was it, if that was the sort of extent of my professional proximity to art, was standing at a counter like restocking 2B pencils or something like that. That was something. And I would, go home and sketch and noodle in Photoshop and obsess over artists and spend all my money on art books and go to a cafe and do life drawing, um, that kind of thing. And then I figured out you can teach too, which is actually why I ended up finishing my degree,
mm,
so my BFA online, because I had an opportunity to to teach at the art schools in Portland. So I taught at PNCA, and then what was the Art Institute. So and that was a viable thing. Like, I feel like that's where the figure drawing came in really handy, because if you there are like I taught in the fashion department at Art Institute in Portland, because it's important for young fashion students to be able to sketch the figure, and like they're called, they're croquis, and like,
mm,
like have a basic understanding of form and gesture is important as a fashion designer. And I had a portfolio that did that. Like, I could do that. Like, I could do that well. I could sketch a 5-minute figure well, and sort of create the kind of contrapposto, anatomical poses that are important to that profession. So I found those little avenues and leveraged that stuff. Um, but yeah, it is interesting. It's kind of, there was a big period of time where you just didn't know. You didn't know if anything was going to come together, if this was going to work out. You're just kind of operating on instinct, really.
mm,
And it wasn't that, it was never that I was like, I'm gonna make it. Like, I never had that feeling. I was just like in the present the whole
mm,
time. And I didn't, I would absolutely have settled for that kind of career. Like, I still feel like I've punching way above my weight, in my current position. Like, I was gonna be like, if I would have been at peace with, maybe I, um, sold prints and taught at two art school classes, and, that carved out a comfortable, quaint little career or something like that. That would have been fine. And that's sort of what I expected. Although, I was definitely driven, by something. Like I knew things could be better in the industry, and I knew that, every time I saw some, a, a film or a piece of art or an illustration or a video game, that I felt like man, I know how to make this better. Like I think I have something to offer here. There was motivation there, intrinsically, and that, getting way back, like, there are comic book artists that I felt like that for sure were very motivational, because they were successful, and because I knew that I could, like, if they could do it, I could do it, kind of a thing. So there's always that kind of motivation too.
Wow, that's very inspiring. I also love your anecdote on like basically photo bashing and concept art and ideation
Hmm.
versus not getting points for just spending time on like basically just pixel bashing almost and making sure everything looks amazing. And
Yeah,
like from I had the same kind of experience, and I'm sure many people have done as well, especially when concept art wasn't exactly like a well-known thing. Like my background is from industrial design, and that was all about line work and line weight and all that good stuff and form.
yeah,
And I discovered digital art before I discovered 3D and all that kind of stuff. And I thought the design had to be perfect as opposed
yeah.
to it's all about the idea. Like, but before you, because you said you learned on the job,
Hmm.
what was your like I guess technical skill level at with Photoshop, and what kind of work were you doing? At least like in the like how far were you using Photoshop or in terms of tools and
On Dead Space,
your
or
methods?
or before that.
Just generally like what was your I guess skill set like with digital art at the time?
It was not nil. It was
Mm.
like, it was, I was treating Photoshop like, it was just a digital piece of paper. Like, that's all.
Yes,
Like,
yes,
the
yes.
only difference was it was digital, and you could control Z instead of erase.
Yeah, yeah.
You know, I was not, yeah, I was completely self-taught. I thought of it, the other program at the time that we were using was Corel Painter.
I
Um,
remember that.
and, all of those, like Gnomon DVDs, we're looking at like Kang Lee or something like that, who's just an amazing draftsman, and like, just, essentially an illustrator or a fine artist. Like, we're not relying on Photoshop, um, to sort of manipulate, or, bash textures in, or incorporate pieces of photos. It was still just essentially illustration. So that's sort
Mm.
of why I was how that was my frame of mind there. Um, and that's where my skill set was for a long time. There were I remember very clearly a few of those, tutorials, similar to sort of that experience I said with photo bashing, where I started to really grasp the potential of using layers and layer styles. And like, there was a tutorial. There was this artist called the Black Frog. I don't know if you remember him.
And
Um, Had an amazing tutorial where he sort of sketched this incredible sort of cyberpunk scene very loosely, and then just brought in like random photos, like of like himself or like his friend at a park, or I forget what it was, and just stretched him in so the perspective was sort of aligned, and threw it on overlay and sort of futzed with him, and all of a sudden these incredible qualities and textures and sort of realism, uh, manifested into this image. And that I remember that. And I think Mache had one of those too, where, you start with a photo, and it just becomes something
mm.
else, so yeah. But it was my, it was all self-taught, and it was very rudimentary for a long, long
Mm.
time.
Did you have like a moment or a project or even like at the stage of a project where it clicked almost? Like okay,
Yeah,
like I know I figured this out now and I know how to use it.
yeah. It was, I mean, it was Dead Space too. It was
Right.
like, um it was something to the effect of like we like I remember like we were designing like uh there was it was like a mall, and then there was like a sort of like a transitional space that was like a checkpoint, and it was all symmetrical, and we had like mass out geometry um from the team because there was sort of gameplay space. And I remember using, like, at the time I had just discovered 2001 A Space Odyssey, and like blew my mind, like I couldn't believe it. I was obsessed. That's one of those aesthetics that really speaks to me and sort of feels like, it's like JC Leyendecker or something like that, where like, holy shit, like this is my people. Or it's like the Chris Cunningham Bjork video or something like that, or anything Aphex Twin does. Like 2001 is one of those films for me, and I was like, that's what this space should be like. It should be like a 2001 space, and because nothing else was like that in Dead Space up to that point. It
Mm.
was like Alien, it was like gothic, high frequency, greeble, dark, dank pipes and hallways and that kind of thing. So introducing this bold, clean aesthetic into the Dead Space universe was exciting and challenging, and I was, provocative a little bit, and I was really excited about that. So, yeah, I just remember at the time, I think it was Tumblr, so I'd had this whole um, um, sort of catalog of inspiration, and it was all in that spirit. That's what sort of pushed me to sort of understand, to sort of self-educate around architecture too. Like, you're like, oh shit, there are architects out there doing this for real and doing it
Mm.
better than Stanley Kubrick's production designer did it, probably, like, so I had this massive sort of catalog of inspiration, and I just started bashing that stuff into that space, and the result was amazing. Like, I loved it. And the art director Ian loved it too, and that was sort of a moment for me.
Awesome.
Yeah.
What's your workflow like now? I guess has it obviously it's evolved for sure, but what are
hmm
your, like, I guess, from back then, Photoshop and just discovering photo bashing? Where is it now?
So I spend, at this point, 90% of my time um, in my art director role at Bungie. So I am not, I am doing a lot of mood boards and maybe quick bashing of stuff,
Mm.
but not doing a lot of what we call IC work in my current role. But I do occasionally take freelance work, like that. I worked on Dune for 9 months or something like that. And fortunately, I've been able to sort of tune my commercial work to sort of um, kind of disciplines that I'm most interested in, which in film is like costume design, the costume concept. So I'm no, nobody's going to come to me. Well, occasionally they do, but I probably wouldn't do it like doing like landscapes or environments or something. I'm sort of not. I've kind of exercised that from my catalog. And so, yeah, my process right now it's still very simple, very rudimentary. It's just ZBrush, Photoshop, and Keyshot. Those are
Mm.
my three. So I'll, you know, when I'm doing costumes or helmets or props or something like that, I'll start with a very basic, super basic, like embarrassingly basic ZBrush sculpt. I've learned ZBrush just enough to be effective, but am still a total, like, I'd probably get like a D in a ZBrush class. Um, um, but I've learned it just enough so that I could crank out renders in Keyshot, light them the way I want to, color them the way I want to, um, and then just bring them into Photoshop and do my Photoshop thing,
Mm.
which is what I've been doing my whole career, which is some combination of photo bashing, photo textures, manipulating values and light with with brushes and layer styles and that kind of thing.
Mm.
And then yeah,
Um,
and then designing, if I design graphic elements, I'll do those on the side.
you mentioned there about obviously like knowing just enough. I think a lot of people can relate to that. I also think it's like a very wise strategy as well because it just shows all you need is just enough to get by. Is that
Yeah.
something that's a part of an actual deliberate philosophy of yours, or just do you tend to just get to a level that you need and then just move on to the next thing?
I think it's deliberate. I mean, I like that, that's what I like about a lot of these digital tools like Photoshop. Like I've always liked that Photoshop was powerful enough and big enough
Mm,
so that everybody can use it a little bit differently and that there's not a right or a wrong way to use it. I mean, that was one of the that in hindsight, that's also I think one of the kind of shitty things about learning those software like that in art school because it's this like very strict curriculum and like if you don't know any better you're like, oh, this is what this does, this is how you have to use this. I was just I have a daughter who is in a what do you call it, it's like CG graphics or some, she's in high school, and I was helping her with one of these with one of her projects, and it was just this very stale kind of depressing like series of commands and how to create cast shadows and bevels, and like it just like if this was your first exposure to Photoshop,
yeah.
why would you think this is a incredibly profound, powerful, creative tool to do a million different things? Like
Mm,
so that's what I like about the way, I'm very much at peace with the fact that I still only know 20% of Photoshop, and you use it completely differently, and as a person, some other person, and so ZBrush is kind of the same way. So I definitely felt like I tuned into that and sort of was at peace with that a long time ago, and it's been helpful. It's like at least sort of alleviates any extra pressure you'd put on yourself to feel like, oh, I'm not doing this right or something like that.
mm. I love that the way to look at things as well. Oddly enough, unrelated, but somehow I got to that thought as well. Like there's something powerful and something that I just personally enjoy that in our particular creative field, like you're never gonna technically get a duplicate. Like there's always someone who does things in a different way, in a
Hmm.
different kind of voice. Maybe things are similar, but there's always something like fingerprints, right? Like there's always something
Yeah,
different, unique to that particular
yeah,
thing,
yeah,
and I think that's really cool. And
yeah. I
not
was
only when
like
you're creating, so
sometimes
yeah, yeah,
when you get even someone like I always like occasionally will, in our on our team or something, we'll share Photoshop files, like, we'll sort of hand off like, hey, let me grab your PSD and I'm going to finish off, or I'm going to add to it, or I'm going to flatten it, do something like that. And it's always interesting to see other artists PSDs because the layers are all aligned, designed, sort of aligned a little bit differently.
yeah.
They use masks a little bit differently or something like that. And it's like this, it's almost like proprietary.
Yes.
I almost feel guilty when I see other people's PSDs, there's something sort of voyeuristic or something about it. It's
No,
weird.
I totally agree with that. Some of the stuff I have to do for Learn Squared, like you do get to see some of the behind the scenes stuff that instructors have done,
Hmm.
and sometimes you open the file and it's like completely different layout, like
Yeah.
you never thought could exist, and it's like, oh well, I don't wouldn't do that, but it's interesting. Yeah, I
Yeah.
do agree. It does feel like, yeah, like the voyeuristic is a great way to describe it, but it's also very insightful as well.
Yeah.
And sometimes in a way we're thinking that, oh shit, like I am definitely not using this enough, and in other ways
Yeah.
it's a case of like I'm overdoing it. Like I just need to like kind of scale it back a little bit as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, regarding post Dead Space 2, what did you work on until you got to Bungie? Was Bungie like a jump after that, or what was that kind of journey like before you ended up at Bungie?
Yeah. So that Dead Space 2 just really opened the door for me, opened a door basically, which was, um, again, this is just sort of luck or sort of serendipity in a way, but once I had Dead Space 2 concept artist on my resume and that portfolio of work, um, that the next step was I got my first full-time in-house job at an art studio that I wanted to work at, which was like that's what I've been wanting my whole life. And like, you know, that was a huge moment for me, and it was at a place called Sinko Design in Portland, Oregon. That is still around and is a really interesting place, and a kind of studio that I didn't even know existed. Basically, they're like um a brand. I don't even know how they would even describe themselves, but branding studio. They're sort of a branding, graphic design, identity, industrial design. They kind of did a lot of stuff. They had, it was a small place, maybe, 50 people work there, something like that, divided into these, teams. They did huge accounts with like Microsoft and Nike. And they also did industrial design. They designed like watches and headphones and stuff like that. But then they did entire sort of like brand identity campaigns and marketing campaigns for big companies. And they had one of their small little teams was a team at the time. I think it was like 4 people or 3 people, 4 people maybe, that did exclusively key art for video games. So key art, box art, basically. And had this sort of very consistent stream of work primarily through Microsoft, but also EA. And they had done a lot. They do like we did like a lot of the Need for Speed titles. When I joined the team, they were working on this game called Dante's Inferno. And then just coincidentally got the contract to do the Dead Space 2 box art. So I was at one point and was simultaneously working on Dead Space 2 concept art and Dead Space 2 box art. Uh, so that, yeah, having that portfolio basically got me a job at that place, and they offered me a full-time salaried position for what, at the time I was like a crazy amount of money, because I was literally working at the art supply store, or something, I forget exactly. But yeah, so that was that. And then I spent about, I forget again, time, what is time? Like a year and a half, maybe? I don't know. I would be terrified if I got that wrong, but a year and a half, maybe a year, maybe 2 years, and worked on probably 6 or 8 big game title key art, box art stuff. And that was really cool. I think in hindsight, the most interesting part about all of that was just that this was not a concept art studio. This was, they came from everything through a branding identity lens. So not only like when they did the Dead Space thing or Dante's Inferno or whatever, not only do you design the illustration that's on the box, but you design the logo and the whole identity system for the game. So website, branding, logo design, key art, all this stuff. So it was, that's obviously, I mean, for anybody, I mean, if you look at my work, graphic design and branding is a big part of it. And so, not that the work we did was particularly compelling, I don't think, but just sort of getting a look at that process and how much energy went into thinking about all of those elements of it was really important. And then at some point during that process, I got contracted to work on Dead Space 3, um, which yeah, just sort of, again, just kind of bolstered my portfolio. At some point in there, actually, I did apply for a job at Bungie and did not get the job. Like, I remember very clearly the work that at the time maybe I was midway through my Dead Space 2 work, and I hadn't really developed my style enough, but I got an interview at Bungie, and we drove up there, and didn't get the job. And I think it wasn't until maybe like a year later, where I had more filled out portfolio. I had the rest of my Dead Space work. I had this Sinko stuff, and then maybe even some Dead Space 3 stuff, and ultimately then did get the job at Bungie.
And what was that like? Like when you started at Bungie, what were you tasked to do? Like, was it specifically on a certain area, or was it
Yeah.
just go wild?
No, I was a senior concept artist right out of the gate, which is in hindsight crazy. Like
Mm.
Bungie, it's like all of a sudden I was like starting shortstop for the Yankees, or maybe I was like a starting striker for Man City or something like that, to put in soccer terms. It was the big leagues for sure. And I was definitely, again, I was like completely out of my depth, like, um, very much in this sort of fake it till you make it kind of head space,
Mm.
but still confident. Like I was still like, I've always had that. I've always felt, you know, I mean, going back to my sort of instinctive collecting as a child, I always felt like I knew what was the best art, and that sort of stuck with me. So that's kind of, even when you're completely out of your depth, it worked as sort of like you know um, um, a shield or something. Like it helped me in even very overwhelming circumstances feel like I still have something to add here. Um, but yeah, so started in 2011 on Destiny, I guess 3.5, 4 years before Destiny even shipped, vanilla Destiny. So that was my first exposure. I never worked on any Halo. It was just Destiny,
Mm.
a couple of years into pre-production or production. And that was crazy. I mean, I mean, I would still advocate that for the art of Destiny, at a certain era, being amongst the best of all time, like the best concept art in sort of its current sort of definition. It was Jamie Jones, first of all. It was just like you sit down at your desk and you look at 75 Jamie Jones paintings that you've never seen before, that are in this incredible cyber night sci-fi fantasy IP, which was Destiny, which is like the IP itself was like, holy fuck, this is incredible. Like it was so inspiring and overwhelming. And there were other artists, like to this day. There's a guy, this guy called Mark Goldsworthy, who has work out in the wild, but probably this underrated, unheralded concept artist, mostly because he's not even really a concept artist at Bungie. He does the skyboxes, but had worked essentially as a concept artist, def, illustrating the worlds of Destiny, and it was just like the most mind-blowing stuff I'd ever seen. And there was guys like Ryan DeMita was there. It was just incredibly. I felt like, I felt like I was working in pre-production on Star Wars or something. Like it was
Mm.
like I was like in 1975 at ILM or something, and it was just like, holy shit, this is incredible. And so yeah, one of the it I started out as an environment focused concept artist on Destiny 1, because that's what my Dead Space portfolio was. It was all environments. It was like, interior spaces, basically. It was like large interior hallways. In Dead Space, there's a million like circle rooms. Like that's a trope. So I had tons of stuff like that. So yeah, I started in abandoned airports in Eastern Europe, and Mars, abandoned architectural spaces in Mars, and stuff like that. I was basically just trying to do the same thing I did on Dead Space, but for Destiny. And I did, I did it pretty well. It was hard because um, I wasn't able to really kind of impose my aesthetic as much as I was on Dead Space, because of the context of what I did on Dead Space. But I had to sort of adjust to a bit to the Dead Space visual world because it was fairly well established with Jamie's work and that kind of thing. So yeah, I kind of just held my own there. But it took a few years for me to really um, carve out the niche of, sort of, I think what ended up being the most important work that I did for Destiny, which was like um, iconography, graphic design, emblems, sigils, and then character design, designing the NPCs and a bunch of the weapons, stuff that was more fashion and graphic sort of oriented. That's sort of how it evolved at Bungie.
Wow. I love the way you explained, like, I think that's every artist's dream, like to be at the same place, like as if you were on a Star Wars project, not only particularly maybe for subject matter, but just realizing how impactful that particular IP would be.
Yeah.
I think you nailed it as well, like in terms of concept art and what it means to the community, and just like in terms of gaming and art in general, like it is a milestone. It is like one of those projects where even if it's not your thing, or maybe even if it is, like it made sure it made its mark, and it
Hmm.
made sure that it made a statement. And obviously that's with the incredible talent that was there. And interestingly enough, like it kind of mirrors what you're doing now with Marathon, where like so you were at a stage where you basically were brought on before the project was even live to the world. So you kind of knew like in its infancy and bringing it to life. What is it like to be at that stage of a project, like building something or working towards something? Is the mentality different to like say just any other concept art job, or is it quite unique? Like when you're at such an early stage and basically bringing a world to life.
It it you at least for my in it was a blur. Like partly because of my personal circumstances of just sort of finally landing there, landing where I landed. The amount of kind of pressure I put on myself.
Hmm.
I did not think of it like I mean I very clearly know that I did not really um, have kind of objective perspective on what I was doing or what was happening. Really, I was in the moment. I was obsessed and sort of passionate and terrified of my craft. And there was also this time where all the artists around me were kind of learning 3D, and like there's an artist Dorje Belbrook who I forgot, I should have grouped him into the Mark and Jamie category of just doing mind-bogglingly, profoundly incredible world-building concept art. He was working in 3D Studio Max at the time, which was just like a mind fuck because that was like, to me, might as well be like a nuclear physicist or something like that. Like I just couldn't. There was no way I was going to learn 3D Studio Max and fold it into my process. But he was using it just profoundly. It was all a combination of all those things just resulted in, I think, probably just a few years of feeling like I was just heads down, like I said, living in the moment, living in the present, obsessing and focusing on my craft, constantly being inspired, but also intimidated. So yeah, and not really, I also, like I love video games. I've played since I was a child, NES. I didn't really have the video game perspective of what Destiny was like.
Hmm.
Destiny itself as a game, as a product, evolved incredibly, and turned out to sort of redefine games as a live service, that kind of thing. But I didn't, I was so focused on just pre-production or production art as a craft. That was all I was focused on. I was focused on quality. I was thinking about, yeah, like I said, thinking about other, like, this is like Sid Mead's Blade Runner work. This is like
Hmm.
Ralph McQuarrie. This is like, this all this stuff. So I was just heads down, and I think that's probably for the best. But it was all, it reflects sort of a relative immaturity too. Like it was, you know, um, if I had sort of the objectivity, and certainly in the games industry that I had now, I would have. probably been a more effective artist, thinking about the spaces I was designing as gameplay spaces, just as much as they were art or illustration, that kind of thing.
Mhm.
So
And
yeah.
what kind of like events led you to becoming an art director?
Um, it's a good question. I mean, so it's one thing, like I've always felt like an art director. Like there's something like even when I wasn't, I felt like, and it was just based on a very sort of loose sense of what the job is, but I've always felt like a kind of confidence in my vision and sort of in my taste that I felt like would intrinsically translates into art direction and whatever sort of half baked sense of that role in my head existed. And I happen to, Bungie is a great place in that there isn't a real strict definition of what an art director is at Bungie. A good art director can kind of come from anywhere. It can, multidisciplinary. I don't know how it really is at other studios. Bungie's like the only studio I've ever really worked at.
Right.
But we have a huge range of types that that do the job of art direction well. I think ultimately the combination of um, the fact that the work I did evolved into something with a very clear point of view. I wasn't a generalist. I wasn't, I think the sort of arguably one of the positive effects of not focusing too much on craft like painting or something like that allowed me to focus on the product a bit more. I've always been interested in what we're doing from a kind of product and brand perspective, doing all of the logo design, um, character design stuff, and then also I sort of very, very much inserted myself into marketing art conversations. Like I was a pain in the ass to the marketing team because I always thought it could be better. No, this isn't the right way to do it. Like, let me do it. like I was just like butting my head in, sending over stuff unsolicited. And finding some success there. Like, I remember at one point I did a bunch of unsolicited key art essentially for Destiny, and we ended up hanging it around the studio, and like that image of the traveler sitting over Earth, that started as an unsolicited sort of Photoshop sketch that I was like, here, this is what it should be. Um, and so all that stuff, like, having a clear point of view, having a certain amount of sort of confidence to insert yourself into these conversations that makes people believe you know what you're talking about, or you at least have the kind of confidence or communication abilities that are important for an art director role. That sort of kind of all congeals into feeling like you're a viable candidate for art director.
Let's talk marathon as much as you can, of course.
Yeah,
Because obviously it's not out yet, um, but just my quick take on that one. It was like, obviously you heard this was coming out, and obviously you know it's Bungie, and thinking, okay, is it that anticipation, that excitement? You mentioned we mentioned music a few times, and like whether your favorite musician or producer or whatever, like what they're cooking up next, you're always excited to see, okay, what are they going to do next, kind of thing.
yeah,
And just seeing it, obviously the trailer was cool. From a designer's perspective, from my perspective, like just seeing the proposal of like the way like the 3D printing with the caterpillars or the other little bugs, for example, like that was just like, yes, of course. Not only just in terms of the idea, but the way it
yeah,
was conveyed as well. Like that's all important. Like how, like, okay, we propose this is how it's going to be done. Excellent. And then obviously even just the look, it looks clean. If that makes sense. Like, yeah, it was amazing. So over to you, man. Let us know what you can, what that's about, what's it like building this brand new thing all over again, and
yeah.
what's your involvement in it as well.
Yeah, it's a lot to unpack. At I started on marathon like um, 2018 or something like that, 18 or 19. So, it's been probably like 5 years or
Wow.
something. At the time, I left Bungie because I accepted an art director role at a startup studio now defunct called Firewalk, and I was there for about, I don't know, 9 or 10 months. I was also working on Dune at the time, but basically hit a point with that project where the allure of marathon was sort of an easy sell for me, from a fantasy perspective. Like, um, the project I had been working on at Firewalk was, I could tell that it was going to be tough for me to really, uh, part of the job would have been the challenge of figuring out how to spin the sort of creative direction in fantasy in a way that I felt good about. And when Marathon came along, it was a much easier fit. It was like, a very, cyberpunk, hard sci-fi. At the time, the extraction shooter inspiration. The team was really great, and it was, and ended up being a fairly straightforward decision for me. So yeah, started on Marathon. Um, when the team, I don't know how many people, there may have just been 10 or 12 folks on there. At the time, I don't even know if they were planning on bringing on an art director. It was very, very early. So yeah, it was just like, again, it was one of those things where, out of my depth, probably. I was just in my very, like, the work that I'd done at Firewalk was like kind of honeymoon phase, like very blue sky world building, not production. And So signing up to be an art director who's going to see a project this big through ship is a very scary and sort of intimidating thing. And it's kind of thing where if you think about it too much, you'll probably, you'll psych yourself out. So, one of those important moments too, where you need to just dive in and assume that it's like sink or swim, and just assume that you're going to swim, and know that that's also the only way to kind of grow. Yeah, very, very early. Um, the game has gone through stylistic changes too, evolutions. Um, which I talk about a little bit. I've talked about on sort of social media a little bit, but at the time when we started, we were going for just like high fidelity realism. That was sort of plan A, was to kind of sort of literally like in the classic video game better graphics sense. These were going to have Marathon was going to have better graphics than Destiny because it was the next game, and so that was a very natural thing, and we were going to lean into material definition and fidelity and detail and all that stuff. Um, so that the pivot from that kind of realism ambition to a more stylized, graphic, simplified approach, that was the biggest, most important um, sort of change from an directional art point of view, and probably in my career, and also for the project itself. And even when that announced trailer was made, we were still actively evolving the style. And so, there was a choice. There was also a very deliberate choice to not try to reflect the exact art style in that announced trailer too. So, the game won't look exactly like that trailer, but it will have the same sort of inherent qualities. And I'm very, very happy with how that trailer came out. I expected it to actually be much more polarizing, that it would, some people would love it, some people would hate it, but it's been almost, sort of universally praised. Um, all- you know, Part of that risk too is because the art style for the game is very personal to me, and sort of a direct extension of my personal influences. And that is, that by just by design, that sort of dates us in a way. Like I have my, like, the sort of 90s 2000s aesthetic. It was a very important part of my career growth. And like I said, like I mentioned, like Chris Cunningham, Aphex Twin, Bjork, there's sort of an electronic sort of music phase that had a sort of aesthetic associated with it. Designers Republic, all that stuff. Mirror's Edge, that's all very much on our sleeves, wearing that on our sleeves with this. So, you know, hoping that the newer younger generations also identify with that without sort of the nostalgia is a risk too. But it seems like it's going well. And it seems like also the industry is in a position where there is an appetite for games like this with a point of view, that sort of take a position, that have sort of taken a risk, that don't look like the other stuff. So it was all very, at a certain point felt like a calculated risk. There was also a point there for sure where I think one of the biggest lessons for me that I would try to impart to, anyone coming up or something, is that, having faith in, like, the things that you like are valid and valuable. Like at a certain point I was like, why not design the art direction around the stuff that's important to me personally? And that is graphic design, that is color, that is this era, this sort of aesthetic era, and these older games. And as opposed to, it's very easy in an art director role to feel like you're just, your only responsibility is to the product and to the public, and to sort of measuring your sort of peers and competitors in the state of the industry, and to sort of have this big sort of equation that will result in the ideal art direction or something like that, as opposed to drawing from just personal sort of instinct and passion and that kind of thing. So it's also, it's a huge testament to Bungie's willingness to take a risk, too. And like, I don't, in hindsight, it does feel like we're kind of getting away with something a little bit, because it is risky. It is a new style. I have a style guide for the game that I go over, once a month with new partners or new hires or something like that. And, I always talk about, drawing a huge amount of inspiration from, like, Alberto Mielgo's Spider-Verse as being this, maybe the best example in history, maybe besides Toy Story or something, where, a brand new style was sort of conjured up out of thin air that felt very unique, and it's personal to the artists behind it, did not have an industry standard, made a lot of people nervous, I'm sure, and then became the standard. And through that sort of strength of vision, and now everybody wants their animation to look a little bit like Spider-Verse, and obviously we know what happened with Toy Story. So that's the company we want to keep, that's the ambition anyway.
That is such a great, like, way to explain how to approach something in a brave way, like, and excellent examples as well. I totally concur, like, in terms of what they were. And it's interesting as well, like you mentioned their risk. Obviously, on one hand, like, when the company's taking a risk, it can make you, because you're taking on the responsibility of that risk, to maybe be risk averse, to ensure that risk comes through, if that makes sense. Did that feel like the case for you, or do you almost, like, double down on the risk and take that as license to be, like, as risky as possible?
I kind of I mean, I definitely leaned into it. Like, I mean, and I still believe that, we're not doing, we're all we're doing is sort of creating an original point of view, which, if done right, has to have value. Like, it has to be valuable. So if you believe in it, you should be confident about it. And it's also true that if the game is fun, like, we're not doing anything that would compromise the game. Like, if the game is fun, the game is fun. Like, the game will do well. We're not, the art and the art direction is still at service of the gameplay. We're sort of a service discipline. But so yeah, there's a number of factors that make me feel confident, and sort of want to lean into this. And another one of them is, if you didn't feel nervous, you're definitely not going to do the thing. Like, you're definitely not going to do the Spider-Verse thing or the Toy Story thing, because it would mean that everybody's comfortable because they've seen this before, and they have their, yep, this sort of checks this, sort of metric, or this UR study confirms that this thing does well. And, like, if you didn't feel a little bit of that, I think that's a sure sign that you're not going to innovate. You're not going to sort of come out with a truly sort of unique, product, or project. And that gets into those kind of cliches where, like, um, if you asked people what they wanted before, it was like that. When it was like the thing with the UR, like, before cars were invented and people rode horses or something, if you asked them if they wanted a car, they would say no, they just want a faster horse, that kind of thing. There's some metaphor there. But yeah, we're just leaning into it.
And obviously, you've gone through the roles of artist, concept artist, senior concept artist, and now art director. What is distinctly? I know I guess it's like a bit obviously obvious of what an art director is, but for you, like, what is the distinct difference between being a concept artist and an art director?
Um, there's so many. I mean, the first, the first one, the most obvious one, is just from a discipline exposure perspective. Like, as a concept artist, you can, your entire career, be sort of, if you're an IC concept artist, if your job is to just make beautiful, compelling art and design, you can do that in a, in a cabin in the woods and be incredibly successful, never having to really relate to, or really understand all of the other disciplines that surround you, that are also sort of these, other sort of critical, mechanisms in this machine, like tech art, or, animation, or effects, or, 3D hard surface content creation, like all this stuff. You can work directly with the art director, you get feedback, and you can just sort of stay in this, bubble, not a negative bubble, but a, sort of walled off from all of that, because you don't need to, like,
Mm.
either it would be valuable, but it's not required. And as an art director, you just can't, you have to, you know, concept art goes from sort of the center of the universe to just one of 8 planets in sort of the solar system, that you have to start, you have to understand how they all relate to each other and connect, and you have to foster them, and just be tuned in a way that you don't really have to as a concept artist. Certainly, you start to understand the limitations of content and executions and ideas. You see where before you might just be like, well, I'm going to draw this thing, it looks fucking cool, let's make it. And then as an art director, you have to be like, you have to have a sort of reality goggles on, and think about all the implications of any design and how the sort of wake. You have to be much more tuned into non-art disciplines, like at Bungie we call it design. Not designers are people that sort of design the experiences of the game and the abilities, and you have to sort of be a partner to all of these other disciplines. And yeah, I mean that's definitely the biggest difference. And then you sort of define what kind of art director you are. Like I said, there's like a bunch of different kinds, certainly at Bungie. I am on one end of the spectrum for sure. I am not a technical art director. Like I am not. I think about sort of vision first, and sort of like form language and design and all that stuff, and I have to rely on other folks around me who are more tuned into sort of the technical realities of production. You need a good team. You need sort of partners and lieutenants around you that sort of cover the aspects of production that you may not know of or aren't not naturally your strengths. So you have to build this team around you. Yeah, all that stuff.
Um, after wearing both hats now, what would you, I guess, like, not a quick advice, but like, I guess, obvious advice that you would give to concept artists out there and also art directors that you feel like are like either maybe core traits or things to keep an eye out for, or just even general advice?
Just general advice for concept artists, or
Like, so now as an art director, obviously, like
yeah.
having to, like, I guess, take the work of a concept artist and then feed it back into the project. Like, what would you advise them, and equally to art directors as well?
Um, that's a good question. I mean, it's hard for me not to immediately kind of go to the craft sort of component of concept art, and like I said, my only real experience has been at Bungie, and I think Bungie is and sort of has become um, a very sort of design focused art department, meaning industrial design and costume design and sort of the sort of functional kind of aspects of design, as opposed to, say, Riot, which I think is safe to say is and this is how I sort of define it, is more sort of like illustration focused. And like, if Bungie designs worlds, Riot illustrates them, or something like that. Like there's this clear delineation there, and figuring out what side of that equation you're on, or naturally sort of inspired to be on, is an important one. It certainly affects how we think about hiring. We're I am always looking for folks who think about um, sort of capital D design, and think about products and industrial design, and are less interested in sort of the craft of illustration. Or like, illustration is a tool to realize design, in a way. It's just one of these tools in your tool belt. To that end, 3D is super important. If you're a concept artist and you're interested in working at a place like Bungie, it's almost a requisite, I think, at this point, that you need to be able to work in 3D. And we think about, if we're designing a helmet, that we're designing in concept, are designing that thing kind of soup to nuts. Like we're designing every angle of it. We're not just making a sort of cool sketch of it and like shooting it over a wall or something like that. So, really immersing yourself um, in 3D, but also thinking beyond the discipline of concept art. I mean, this is like, I'm a broken record. I say this all the time, but like concept art is a discipline. It exists to mimic other disciplines in a way. It's not, it's sort of like I even think about like the old school guys, that come from like the automotive industry or something like that. Like you hire a concept artist when you need something, when you need, you hire a concept artist when you need fashion design or architecture or industrial design quickly, and you need someone who can put on those hats and do everything sort of effectively. And so it's paramount that that person is tuned in to those industries. And it would, even to this day, it doesn't matter if it's like in the 60s or the aughts or whatever. Being tuned in to all of those industries is critical, because there is no craft, there is no discipline of concept art. It's like you're like I said, you're wearing a different hat at a different time. Like you're an illustrator, you're a fine artist, you're an industrial designer, you're a fashion designer. So that psychology is super important. And then yeah, figuring out quickly, as far as like the path to art direction. I think, because it's the only thing I've known from concept art, like figuring out what kind, if you're coming from concept art, interested in art direction, figuring out what it is about concept art that really inspires you or that motivates you. Is it the craft, or is it like the vision? If it's the vision, I think there's a more intuitive, for my money anyway, path towards art direction, that sort of belief in your perspective on all of this stuff. You're not just you're not a generalist. And again, like some of I mean, the best concept artists of all time, I think of as generalists. Like Jamie Jones, for example, like he does everything amazingly. Jamie's never had an ambition to be an art director at Bungie, or else he could have easily. um, but he gets everything he needs from the craft of sort of capital A art, of painting, of understanding light and shadow, of draftsmanship, of composition, all that stuff. That's all that's, he will be happy for the rest of his life just immersing himself in that. So figuring out if that's what does it for you, or if there's something else, or if you feel like you want to, I've always felt like I said, I wanted to sort of impose my vision at a bigger and bigger scale. And that's what is most exciting to me. Like these things, like introducing a new IP to the world, like Marathon, that's what I wanted to do. The reaction to seeing the trailer for the first time, this is exactly what I wanted to do. And I've always sort of known that. So I don't know, that kind of answers, or it's kind of a take on that question.
Amazing. Final question. I got so many questions I could ask you, but a few final questions before we wrap up. I got to ask you about Dune. Again, you mentioned earlier about like working on stuff that ends up being iconic. Obviously, Destiny's one of those. It sounds like Marathon's going to be one of those too. Dune, definitely in terms of impact in the industry, in terms of like not only just as other artists, but even just the general population, general civilians who like films, but then even I know a lot of people who just like films. Like they don't really geek out about the designs kind of things and cinematography and what have you. But even then, certain IPs like Dune, for example, people just can't help it but geek out. What is it like working on that?
It was amazing. It was yeah, I like it, it was not, I don't know if it's a blur, but it's one of those things where it just, I didn't even know really how it happened. Like I think somebody recommended me at some point. I got a cold call from I think it was Legendary at the time. And I mean, again, it was one of these things where if you thought about it too much at the time, you probably would freak out. But like, I started off that project working directly with Denis Villeneuve and Patrice Vermette, the production designer and the director, one on one. Like it was Denis sending me briefs and notes and creative direction for the still suit. And then we went right on to like the still suite, the suite of all of those, like the thumper and the backpack and the tent and all that stuff. It was another one of those projects where um, they had an incredible amount of incredibly compelling production world building art already done. They have like it was also cool because it was another one of those moments where it's like, oh my God, there are teams of just incredible artists out there that we've never seen, that because they're not on social media, they're not like concept artists posting on art forums and stuff like that. They're just like working in the industry. Um, and this was one of those examples where, Patrice sent me production concepts of Arrakis and all these amazing architectural, like brutalist, cool, like it was just a very fleshed out, very compelling visual world, and I knew right away that like this is awesome. The first few months of that was just like dream territory where it was just sending concepts back and forth to Patrice and Denis. It started out interestingly, where Denis just asked me to design, and it was like quote the still suit of my dreams, without any direction. Like he didn't give me any cues or clues or anything like that. And I did something totally different than what we ended up with. I well, I didn't. I lacked context, to be fair to myself at the time. Um, but like I looked more like at Lawrence of Arabia, and I felt like, man, if we're thinking functionally and practically, designing a dark colored still suit doesn't really make sense. So I designed a white one and with more cloth and sort of flowing, sort of fabric and that kind of thing, and definitely included some interesting like materials and textures and stuff. But that's when he started showing me more stuff, and it became clear that the vision for Dune it was like a war movie. That's sort of how he described it. This was a bleak, sort of brutal war film, and that's when those designs started getting a little more, I don't know, sort of subdued, industrial, dark, that kind of thing. But yeah, it was incredible. I had like I said, I had just sort of a dream first few months. When the production really sort of started ramping up, it got, you kind of entered into the typical kind of challenges where like everything's always on fire. They kind of switched costume teams midway through. There were budget issues. At some point with the costume, we were designing some very expensive stuff
Mm.
so there was some interesting kind of pivots there. But yeah, so it was awesome. It was, definitely the favorite film I've worked on. I felt like, I worked on the Ghost in the Shell live action too, which was equally, would have been on sort of the same level bucket list wise, but obviously, didn't exactly turn out the way maybe some of us hoped. But Dune certainly did. I think, it feels amazing to, it at least has the chance of being this, to live in sort of the hallowed ground of like a Star Wars or Lord of the Rings in terms of a trilogy. So that feels really, really cool.
What was like? What kind of I guess even from your perspective, do you have a different approach when you're working on film versus game? Obviously, there's distinct differences in terms of the nature, especially obviously time being one of them in terms of
Yeah.
productions on both. But from your perspective, do you approach them differently?
Yeah, well, I mean, first of all, there's just when I work on film, I'm basically just I go sit in my concept artist chair, sort of or I switch hats. So
Mm.
I'm an IC, I'm a hand, I think, my job is very different, and I get to like really focus on specifics and details. So it's really fun and sort of a nice break from the sort of macro pressure of art direction. So yeah, you got to just zone out and think about, how cool can this backpack be, and what are the inspirations, and dig into the details. And then there is definitely, to your point, like a big difference between being a concept artist on games and versus film. It's like working in games is at least in my experience, glacial speed compared to film, where it's just everything's on fire. You have to really think about, in games you might have 2 or 3 weeks to sort of finish a prop, or a sort of a hero object or a helmet, whereas in film you probably have to have sent, you know 2 or 3 concepts of that within a week, and assume that probably that's it. So it's just a much faster pace of work, which has its pros and cons.
Joseph, we've got to wrap up now.
Yeah.
Any final thoughts or words from yourself before we do?
Um, I mean, anybody listening, you can always feel free to reach out to me on social medias or something. Stay tuned for marathon, and I hope everyone responds to it. I'm very excited about it, and so fingers crossed.
Awesome. Joseph, absolutely
Yeah.
incredible. Thanks so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Cool. A massive thanks to Joseph for that incredible conversation. Hit the links to see what he's up to, and be sure to give him a follow. Then head to learnsquare.com to check out our courses and pick the ones to help you in developing your creative identity. Don't forget, all of our first lessons are free. I've been your host, Aaron Danda. Till next time.